The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop that sent Caroline Miller sprawling against the worn leather seat, her carefully pressed traveling dress now covered in dust from the 2-week journey that had brought her from Philadelphia to the wilds of Montana Territory in the summer of 1876. She clutched the crumpled letter in her gloved hand, the one from Mr. Thomas Hendricks of Copper Ridge, the man who had promised to marry her sight unseen, the man who represented her only escape from a life of servitude in her uncle's boarding house after her parents had died of fever 3 years prior. Caroline was 22 years old, educated enough to read and write beautifully, and desperate enough to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride, despite every instinct that screamed this was madness. The driver's gruff voice called down from above. "Copper Ridge, miss. End of the line." Caroline smoothed her auburn hair, tucked the letter into her reticule, and accepted the driver's weathered hand as she stepped down into ankle-deep mud. The town before her consisted of perhaps 15 buildings, scattered along a single rutted street, with mountains rising like ancient sentinels in every direction, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the summer heat in the valley. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke and something wild she could not name. Her trunk landed with a thud beside her, and before she could ask the driver to wait, the stagecoach was already rattling away toward the next settlement. She stood alone in the middle of the street, acutely aware of the stares from the handful of men lounging outside what appeared to be a saloon. A painted sign creaked in the wind above a mercantile. Somewhere a dog barked. Caroline lifted her chin and walked toward the mercantile, her boots squelching in the mud, determined not to show the fear that coiled in her stomach like a snake. The mercantile door opened with a jangle of bells. Inside, a portly man with impressive mutton chops looked up from behind a counter stacked with bolts of fabric and tins of coffee. "Help you, miss?" "I'm looking for Mr. Thomas Hendricks," Caroline said, keeping her voice steady. "I was told he lives in Copper Ridge." The shopkeeper's expression shifted to something she could not quite read, discomfort mixed with pity. "Thomas Hendricks, you say?" "Yes, I've come from Philadelphia. He's expecting me." The shopkeeper removed his spectacles and polished them on his apron, a gesture that made Caroline's heart begin to pound. "Miss, I'm real sorry to tell you this, but Thomas Hendricks passed on about 6 weeks back. Took a fever. We buried him in the cemetery up on the hill." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Caroline's feet. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. There must be some mistake. "No mistake, miss. I knew Thomas for near about 10 years. Good man, kept to himself mostly, had a little cabin about 2 miles west of here. You say he was expecting you?" Caroline's throat had gone dry as dust. "I am his intended bride. We corresponded for 4 months. His last letter arrived 3 weeks ago. He said nothing about being ill." The shopkeeper's face creased with genuine sympathy. "I am powerful sorry, miss. That is a terrible shock coming all this way. Do you have folks back east you can return to?" Caroline thought of her uncle's house, the endless drudgery, her cousin's husband who looked at her in ways that made her skin crawl, and she heard herself say, "No, I have no one." "Well now," the shopkeeper scratched his chin. "That is a predicament. We do not have much in the way of accommodations here. There's a boarding house of sorts above the saloon, but it is not the kind of place a respectable lady ought to stay." "I have some money," Caroline said, though the few dollars in her reticule would not last long. "Perhaps I could find work. I can read and write. I can keep accounts. I can sew and cook and clean." The shopkeeper looked doubtful. "Copper Ridge is not much of a town for employment, miss. Most folks here are miners or trappers. The few families we have tend to their own." The bell jangled again, and Caroline turned to see a man enter, and her breath caught in her throat. He was enormous, easily 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway and arms that strained the fabric of his worn flannel shirt. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, slightly unkempt, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that arrested her, a startling shade of gray-blue that swept over her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly warm, despite the cool interior of the shop. "Silas," the shopkeeper said with obvious relief. "Good timing. This young lady here just arrived from Philadelphia. She came to marry Thomas Hendricks." The big man's gaze sharpened on Caroline. His voice when he spoke was deep and rough, like gravel rolling down a mountainside. "Thomas is dead." So I have just learned, Caroline said, lifting her chin. She would not be intimidated by this mountain of a man, no matter how unsettling his presence. She has got no place to go, the shopkeeper continued. I was just telling her that Copper Ridge is not the best place for a single woman to find herself stranded. Silas studied Caroline with an expression she could not decipher. She found herself studying him back, noting the way his massive hands rested on his belt, the way he stood with the easy confidence of a man completely at home in his own skin. There was something almost wild about him, as though he belonged more to the mountains than to civilization. Thomas's cabin is still standing, Silas said finally. If she is meant to be his bride, seems to me she has got a right to it. The shopkeeper blinked. Now, Silas, I do not think that is exactly how the law works. Thomas had no kin. The cabin will just rot otherwise. She came all this way. Seems only fair. Silas's gaze had not left Caroline's face. Unless you have got other plans, miss. Caroline's mind raced. A cabin would mean shelter, at least temporarily. It would give her time to figure out what to do next. I would be grateful for any shelter, she said carefully, but I do not wish to take something that is not rightfully mine. Thomas would have wanted someone to use it, Silas said. He was a decent man, would not have liked the idea of you stranded. He paused. It is rough country, though. The cabin is isolated, 2 miles from town up a mountain track. You would be alone. Something in the way he said it made Caroline think he was testing her. I'm not afraid of solitude, she said, which was only partially true. Solitude is one thing. Mountain lions and bears are another. Plus you have got claim jumpers and drifters passing through, not all of them friendly. Are you trying to frighten me, Mr. Silas? Just Silas. And no, miss, just telling you true. This is not Philadelphia. I am quite aware of that. Caroline straightened her shoulders. If you would be kind enough to direct me to this cabin, I will manage. Something that might have been respect flickered in those gray-blue eyes. I will do better than that. I will take you there. My place is about a mile beyond Thomas's old cabin. We are practically neighbors. The shopkeeper looked as though he wanted to protest, but thought better of it. Well, if Silas vouches for the arrangement, I suppose it will do. You will be needing supplies, miss. Caroline spent the next hour selecting necessities while trying not to think too hard about the meager state of her funds. She purchased flour, coffee, salt pork, beans, matches, candles, and a sturdy wool blanket. Silas waited without complaint, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed over his broad chest, occasionally suggesting items she had not thought of, like kerosene for lamps and extra ammunition. I do not have a gun, Caroline said. Thomas did. Should still be at the cabin. I will show you how to use it. That's not necessary. I do not intend to shoot anyone. Not talking about people, talking about rattlesnakes and rabid animals. You will need to know. Caroline wanted to argue but recognized the futility. This man, this Silas, clearly knew this land in ways she never would. Thank you, she said instead. He nodded once and gathered up her packages as though they weighed nothing. I will load these on my horse. You wait here while I fetch a mule for your trunk. He was gone before she could respond. The shopkeeper gave her an encouraging smile. Silas is a good man, miss. Keeps to himself mostly, lives up in the high country, but he is honest and decent. You could do worse for a neighbor. What does he do? Caroline asked. Trapping mostly, hunting. He brings in furs and game. Self-sufficient type. Been in these mountains for near about 7 years now. Came out here after the war, same as a lot of men. The war. Caroline did quick arithmetic and guessed Silas was somewhere in his early 30s. Young enough to have fought, old enough to have seen things that changed a man. She had seen it in Philadelphia too, the soldiers who returned with shadows in their eyes. Silas returned, leading a sturdy mule, and within minutes he had secured Caroline's trunk and supplies with practiced efficiency. Then he brought out his own horse, a massive bay gelding that suited his size, and swung into the saddle with fluid grace. He offered Caroline his hand. You can ride up behind me. It is too far to walk in those shoes. Caroline looked at her impractical buttoned boots and then at his outstretched hand. In Philadelphia, riding behind a strange man would have been scandalous. Here, it seemed to be simple practicality. She placed her hand in his and found herself lifted as though she weighed nothing, settled behind the saddle. Hold on, Silas said. and Caroline gingerly placed her hands on his waist, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fabric. They rode out of Copper Ridge with the mule trailing behind, following a track that climbed steadily into the mountains. Caroline tried not to think about how close she was pressed against this stranger's back, how she could feel the heat of him even through their layers of clothing. The forest closed around them, towering pines that blocked out the sky, and the only sounds were the creak of leather, the plod of hooves, and the whisper of wind through branches. How did you know Thomas Hendricks?" Caroline asked after a long silence, more to break the tension than from genuine curiosity. "He was my closest neighbor. We helped each other sometimes. He was not much of a mountain man, struggled with the winters, but he was stubborn, determined to make a go of it." "Why did he want a wife?" Silas was quiet for so long, Caroline thought he would not answer. Finally he said, "Loneliness, I expect. The mountains are beautiful, but they are hard. A man can lose himself up here if he is not careful." "And you? Are you lonely?" She felt him stiffen slightly. "I chose this life. Thomas did not really. He came out here running from something back east. A man running rarely finds what he's looking for." "What about a woman running?" Caroline asked softly. Silas turned his head slightly, and she saw his profile, the strong line of his jaw beneath the beard. "I expect that depends on what she is running from and what she hopes to find." The cabin appeared without warning, a small log structure tucked into a clearing surrounded by aspens. It was more substantial than Caroline had feared, but less welcoming, with a sagging porch and shuttered windows that gave it a forsaken air. Silas dismounted and lifted Caroline down, his hands spanning her waist, and she found herself looking up into his face, suddenly aware of just how large he was, how easily those hands could crush or protect. "Thank you," she managed. He released her and turned to unlatch the door. Inside, the cabin was dim and musty, consisting of a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves that still held a few supplies. Dust covered everything. Caroline's heart sank. "It needs work," Silas said, stating the obvious, "but the roof is sound and the chimney draws clean. I will help you get settled." For the next 2 hours, Silas worked with tireless efficiency. He swept out the cabin, checked the roof, and chinking between logs, brought in firewood, filled the water barrel from the nearby creek, and showed Caroline how to light the stove. He found Thomas's rifle and cleaned it, then took Caroline outside to show her how to load and fire it. The recoil nearly knocked her over the first time, and Silas caught her with one steady hand on her shoulder. "Brace yourself better," he said. "Like this." He positioned her, his hands impersonal but firm, adjusting her stance. "Try again." The second shot was better, the third better still. By the sixth, Caroline was beginning to feel something like confidence. When she lowered the rifle, Silas nodded approval. "You learn quick, that is good. Keep the rifle loaded and by the door. Do not hesitate to use it if you need to." "Against what exactly?" "Like I said, animals mostly. But if someone comes around and you do not like the look of them, fire a warning shot. Sound carries in the mountains. I will hear it and come." "You cannot be responsible for me," Caroline protested, those gray-blue eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. "You are my neighbor now. Out here, that means something. We look after our own." Caroline felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear she had carried since learning of Thomas's death. "I do not know how to thank you." "No need for thanks, it's just how things are done." Silas glanced at the sun, now sinking toward the peaks. "I should head back. You will be all right for the night?" "Yes," Caroline said, with more confidence than she felt. Silas mounted his horse but paused, looking down at her. "I will come by tomorrow with fresh meat and check on you. If you need anything before then, follow the track another mile north. My place is a larger cabin near a waterfall. You cannot miss it." "Silas?" Caroline said as he gathered the reins. "Why are you doing this?" He considered the question. "Because Thomas should have been here to meet you, and he would have wanted someone to help. And because a woman brave enough to come all this way to marry a stranger deserves better than to be left alone in the wilderness." He touched the brim of his hat. "Lock the door, Miss Caroline." He rode away, and Caroline realized she had never told him her first name. The shopkeeper must have mentioned it while she was distracted. She watched until he disappeared into the trees, then turned to face her new home, wondering what on earth she had gotten herself into. That first night was the longest of Caroline's life. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, every snap of settling logs made her jump. She lay in the narrow bed, wrapped in her blanket, the loaded rifle within reach, and tried not to think about mountain lions or bears or claim jumpers. She thought instead about Silas, about his steady competence, the way his presence had made her feel safe despite his intimidating size. She thought about his hands, calloused and strong but surprisingly gentle. She thought about the loneliness he had mentioned and wondered what kind of man chose to live alone in these mountains and whether he truly preferred solitude or simply accepted it. When dawn finally broke, Caroline rose stiff and exhausted. She washed in cold water from the barrel, changed into a simpler dress, and set about making the cabin truly habitable. She scrubbed every surface, aired out the musty blankets, organized the supplies, and discovered a small garden plot behind the cabin that had gone wild but might be salvaged. The work was hard, and her hands, soft from years of indoor labor, quickly blistered. But it felt good to have purpose, to be doing something other than worrying. She was hauling water from the creek when she heard hoofbeats. Silas appeared leading his horse and carrying what looked like a haunch of venison over his shoulder. He took in her flushed face and the water buckets without comment and simply carried the buckets inside for her before depositing the venison on the table. "Fresh killed this morning," he said. "I will show you how to preserve it." "You do not need to keep helping me," Caroline said, though she was desperately grateful. "I know I do not need to." Silas began unpacking items from his saddlebag, including salt and cheesecloth. "But if I leave you to figure everything out alone, you will make mistakes that could cost you. No shame in learning from someone who knows." So Caroline learned. She learned how to salt and smoke meat, how to bank a fire so it would last through the night, how to recognize animal tracks and which ones meant danger. Silas proved to be a patient teacher, explaining things in his economical way, demonstrating when words were insufficient. He did not coddle her or act as though she was foolish for not knowing these things. He simply taught. Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Silas would arrive in the morning or afternoon, always with some practical reason, bringing meat or fresh fish from the creek, helping repair the sagging porch, teaching her how to identify edible plants and which berries were safe. Caroline found herself watching for him, listening for the sound of his horse. His presence had become the anchor of her days. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Caroline worked in the garden while Silas repaired a section of fence that kept deer from the vegetables. The sun was warm, and Caroline had removed her bonnet, letting her auburn hair catch the light. She looked up to find Silas watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "What is it?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. He looked away quickly, driving another post into the ground with unnecessary force. "Nothing. You have got dirt on your face." Caroline wiped her cheek, smearing the dirt worse. "This is harder work than I imagined. Everything out here is harder. You are managing well." Silas set down his mallet and leaned on the fence post. "Most people from back east would have given up by now." "I have nowhere to give up to," Caroline said honestly. "This is my life now. I may as well learn to live it." "There is more to it than that." Silas's gaze was steady. "You have got grit. You do not complain. You work hard, and you learn fast. Those things matter out here more than anything else." The compliment, delivered in his matter-of-fact way, warmed Caroline more than any flowery praise ever had. "My mother used to say that adaptability was a virtue. I never understood what she meant until now." "Tell me about your family," Silas said, surprising her. He rarely asked personal questions. So Caroline told him, sitting there in the garden with dirt under her nails and sweat on her brow. She told him about her parents, kind people who had run a small bookshop in Philadelphia, about their deaths from fever, about her uncle who took her in but treated her as little more than a servant. She told him about the suffocating feeling of having no future, no prospects, no way out except through marriage to a stranger. Silas listened without interrupting, his eyes on her face, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're brave. Coming out here, starting over, that takes courage." "Or desperation," Caroline said with a humorless laugh. "Sometimes those are the same thing." Silas stood and brushed off his hands. "I should head back. There's a storm coming in tomorrow or the day after. You will want to make sure you have enough firewood stacked inside. How do you know there's a storm coming? He pointed to the peaks. The clouds, the way the wind has shifted, the way the animals are acting. You learn to read the signs. Will you teach me? The words came out before Caroline could stop them, too eager, too revealing. Something flickered in Silas's eyes. Yes, he said simply. I will teach you. The storm hit 2 days later with a fury that shocked Caroline. Rain lashed the cabin, wind howled through the trees, and thunder rolled through the mountains like cannon fire. Caroline huddled by the fire, grateful for the stacked wood, for the tight roof, for all the preparations Silas had insisted upon. She thought of him in his cabin a mile away and wondered if he was warm and dry, if he was thinking of her. The storm lasted through the night and into the next day. By afternoon, it had diminished to a steady rain. Caroline was staring out the window when she saw Silas emerge from the forest, water streaming off his oiled coat. Her heart leaped in a way that had nothing to do with simple gratitude. She opened the door before he could knock. Is everything all right? Wanted to make sure you were managing. Water dripped from his hair onto his shoulders. The creek is running high. Do not try to cross it until the water goes down. Come inside, you are soaked. I will drip all over your clean floor. I do not care. Come in. Silas hesitated, then stepped inside, seeming to fill the small cabin. Caroline had never been so aware of a man's presence, of the way he moved, the way he smelled of rain and pine and something earthier. She busied herself stoking the fire, pouring coffee from the pot she kept warm. Here, she handed him a tin cup. Their fingers brushed, and Caroline felt the contact like a spark. Silas wrapped his large hands around the cup and drank. You weathered your first mountain storm. How did it feel? Terrifying and beautiful at the same time, Caroline admitted. I kept thinking about how small I am compared to all this. She gestured toward the window, the mountains beyond. That is the right way to think about it. The mountains do not care about us. They were here long before and will be here long after. But if you respect them, they will provide. Is that why you live here? Because of that feeling? Silas was quiet, staring into his coffee. When he spoke, his voice was low. I came here because I needed to be somewhere that the war had not touched, somewhere clean. The mountains do not judge. They do not care what you have done or what you have seen. They just are. It was the most personal thing he had shared. Caroline sat down at the table across from him. Do you ever regret it, being alone up here? His eyes met hers, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. I was not lonely until recently. What changed? Silas set down his cup with deliberate care. You arrived. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Caroline's heart hammered against her ribs. Silas, I do not understand. He stood abruptly, as though the small cabin could not contain him. I should go. The rain is letting up. But he did not move toward the door. Instead, he stood there, his back to her, tension in every line of his body. This was not supposed to happen. What was not supposed to happen? Caroline stood as well, moving closer, though every instinct screamed this was dangerous. Silas turned, and the look in his eyes stole her words. I was not supposed to care. You were Thomas's bride. You came here for him. I was just supposed to help you get settled, make sure you were safe, and then keep my distance like I do with everyone. His hands clenched at his sides. But I cannot stop thinking about you. I wake up thinking about you. I go to sleep thinking about you. I find excuses to come here every day when I know I should stay away. Caroline's breath came short. Why should you stay away? Because you deserve better than a scarred mountain man who barely knows how to live among people anymore. Because you came here for a different life, not to be trapped with someone like me. Because I've got nothing to offer you except a hard life in an isolated cabin. You are wrong. Caroline closed the distance between them, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the wet fabric. You have been kind to me, patient. You have taught me how to survive here. You have made me feel less alone. That is not nothing, Silas. His hand came up to cover hers, his touch gentle despite his size. Caroline, I am not a good man. I have done things in the war, things I cannot take back. I came to these mountains to get away from who I was. I do not know if I am capable of being what you need. What I need is someone who sees me as more than a burden or an obligation. What I need is someone who treats me like a person with my own mind and my own strength." Caroline's voice grew fierce. "You have done that from the first moment. You did not try to send me back east or treat me like I was helpless. You taught me. You trusted me to learn. Do you know how rare that is?" Silas's thumb traced across her knuckles, the gesture unbearably tender. "You scare me more than anything in these mountains ever has." "Why?" "Because I care what happens to you. Because the thought of you being hurt or afraid makes me want to tear down trees with my bare hands. Because when I'm with you, I feel human again, in a way I have not felt in 7 years." Caroline's free hand came up to touch his bearded jaw, feeling him tense under her palm. "I was supposed to marry a stranger. Thomas would have been a stranger even after we wed, two people bound by obligation and loneliness. But you, Silas, you do not feel like a stranger. You feel like someone I have been waiting to find." Caroline. Her name was a warning and a plea. "I know it is too soon. I know I have only been here a few weeks, but I cannot deny what I feel. I came to Montana expecting duty. I found something else instead." Silas's control seemed to break. He pulled her against him, one arm wrapping around her waist, the other hand cupping the back of her head. "Tell me to leave. Tell me this is wrong." Caroline tilted her face up to his. "I will not tell you either of those things." He kissed her then, and it was like the storm, fierce and wild and beautiful. Caroline had been kissed before, chased pecks from unsuitable suitors in Philadelphia, but nothing had prepared her for this. Silas kissed her like a drowning man who had just found air, like she was precious and necessary. His beard was rough against her skin, his mouth hot and demanding, and Caroline kissed him back with all the loneliness and longing she had carried for so long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the day I first saw you in the mercantile, standing there with your chin up, refusing to be beaten." "I wanted you to," Caroline confessed. "I kept telling myself I was being foolish, that it was too soon, that you were just being neighborly. But every time you left, I felt the absence like a physical ache." "This will not be easy," Silas said, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "Loving me, I mean. I am not refined. I do not have pretty manners. I live rough. The winters are brutal and the solitude can drive people mad." "Loving you," Caroline repeated, savoring the words. "Is that what we are talking about? I do not know what else to call it. I have never felt this way before, not even before the war." His eyes searched hers. "But if you need time, if you want me to court you proper, I will wait. I will do whatever you need." Caroline smiled, feeling something bright and warm unfurl in her chest. "I think arriving on the wrong doorstep and ending up as your neighbor was the rightest thing that ever happened to me. Thomas's cabin was the right address after all. It brought me to you." Silas smiled then, a real smile that transformed his stern face into something younger, lighter. "The right address," he murmured. "I like that." They stood there wrapped in each other's arms while the rain pattered on the roof and the fire crackled in the hearth, and Caroline thought that she had never felt safer or more at home than she did in that moment. Over the following weeks, Caroline and Silas fell into a new pattern. He still came by daily, but now there was a different quality to his visits. He would kiss her in greeting, a gesture that never failed to make Caroline's heart race. They worked together on her cabin and his, preparing for the winter that Silas promised would be harsh. He taught her to shoot accurately, to track deer, to preserve food, to read weather signs. But there were softer moments, too, evenings sitting by the fire, while Caroline read aloud from one of the few books she had brought from Philadelphia. And Silas whittled, his hands shaping wood into beautiful, useful things. "Where did you learn to do that?" Caroline asked one evening, watching him craft a wooden spoon with deft strokes of his knife. "My father was a carpenter. I grew up around wooden tools. It is one of the few good things I remember from before." "Before the war?" "Before everything." Silas's hands stilled. "My father died when I was 15. My mother could not manage the farm alone. I was the oldest of 4 children. I tried, but there was not enough money. When the war started, I enlisted. The pay helped support my mother and siblings." Where are they now? Pain flickered across Silas's face. Gone. My mother died while I was fighting. My sisters went to live with relatives. My brother was killed at Shiloh. By the time the war ended, there was nothing left to go back to. Carolyn moved from her chair to sit beside him, taking his hand. I am sorry. It was a long time ago, but his grip on her hand was tight. I learned that trying to hold on to things only brings pain. Better to live simply, need nothing, expect nothing, safer that way. But lonely, Caroline said softly. Yes, Silas admitted, but loneliness was better than loss. He turned to look at her. At least it was until you showed up and made me reconsider everything. Are you sorry I did? No. He kissed her then, slow and sweet. I'm grateful, terrified, but grateful. What terrifies you? Losing you, failing you, not being enough. Caroline touched his face, feeling the rough beard, the strong bones beneath. You are more than enough. You are everything I did not know I needed. As summer deepened into autumn, the mountains transformed into a blaze of gold and crimson. Caroline had never seen anything so beautiful. She and Silas spent long days preparing for winter, and Caroline marveled at how much her life had changed. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and strong. She could split firewood, haul water, shoot accurately, and navigate the forest trails. She was becoming a woman of the mountains, and she loved it. One crisp October afternoon, Silas arrived at her cabin with a serious expression. We need to talk about winter, he said without preamble. Caroline set aside the shirt she had been mending. What about it? It gets bad up here, really bad. The snow can pile up to the eaves. Temperatures drop so low that water freezes in the cabin if you do not keep the fire going. Sometimes you can be snowed in for weeks at a time. He paced the small cabin, clearly agitated. I do not like the idea of you being here alone when that happens. What are you suggesting? Silas stopped pacing and faced her. Move in with me. My cabin is bigger, better insulated. It has a larger fireplace and better supplies. We would be together if something went wrong. Silas, that would not be proper. We are not married. Then marry me. The words came out almost angry, as though he was frustrated with himself for saying them. Marry me, Carolyn. I know I should do this better, should court you proper and give you time. But winter is coming and I need to know you are safe. I need you with me. Caroline's heart thundered in her chest. Are you proposing to me? Yes? No. I do not know. Silas dragged his hand through his hair. I'm making a mess of this. You deserve romance and pretty words. You deserve a man who can give you a fine house and an easy life. But all I can offer is myself and a hard life in the mountains and a promise that I will do everything in my power to make you happy and keep you safe. I love you, Carolyn. I have loved you since the day you stood in that mercantile with dust on your dress and fire in your eyes. I know it is too soon, and I know I am not what you dreamed of. But I'm asking anyway, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore. Carolyn stood and crossed to him, taking both his hands in hers. Yes, she said simply. Silas blinked. Yes? Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I will move into your cabin. Yes to all of it. Caroline smiled up at him. You are wrong about one thing, though. You are exactly what I dreamed of, even though I did not know it until I met you. Silas pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet, and kissed her with a passion that left her breathless. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. You will not regret this. I swear to you, Caroline, I will spend every day earning your trust and your love. You already have both, she said. They were married a week later in Copper Ridge by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. The shopkeeper and his wife served as witnesses, and Caroline wore her best dress, the one she had traveled from Philadelphia in, now cleaned and pressed. Silas wore new clothes purchased from the mercantile, though he looked uncomfortable in the stiff collar. His hair was neatly tied back, his beard trimmed, and when he said his vows, his deep voice was steady and sure. Caroline's voice shook only slightly when she promised to love and cherish him. The ring he slipped on her finger was simple silver, but it felt more precious than any jewel. After the brief ceremony, they shared a meal at the boarding house dining room. The few townspeople who attended were curious but kind, and Caroline sensed that Silas was well respected here, despite his solitary nature. The shopkeeper's wife, a motherly woman named Agnes, pulled Caroline aside. "You are getting a good man," Agnes said. "Silas is as solid as they come. He has helped half the people in this town at one time or another and never asked for anything in return. You will be safe with him." "I know," Caroline said. "I am very lucky." "We are all lucky," Agnes countered. "Silas has been alone too long. It is good to see him smile again." They rode back to Silas's cabin in the afternoon light, Caroline seated before her new husband, his arms bracketing her, his chin resting on the top of her head. The cabin appeared through the trees, larger than Thomas's place, built with obvious care. It was 2 rooms instead of 1, with a sleeping loft above and a wide porch that overlooked a waterfall tumbling down the mountainside. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Caroline realized Silas must have banked the fire before leaving that morning so they would return to warmth. He dismounted and lifted her down, but instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Caroline Reed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Mrs. Reed," Caroline repeated, testing the name. "I like the sound of that." Silas set her down gently, and Caroline looked around her new home. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace with comfortable chairs arranged before it. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books and carved wooden figures. A large table occupied the center of the room, and through an open door, Caroline glimpsed a smaller room that served as a pantry and washroom. A ladder led to the sleeping loft. "It is wonderful," Caroline said honestly. "It is just a cabin," Silas said, but she could hear the pleasure in his voice. "It is a home," Caroline corrected. "Our home." That night, after a simple supper, Silas carried Caroline up to the loft where a large bed was covered with furs and quilts. He set her down gently, and in the lamplight, Caroline saw uncertainty in his eyes. "I will be patient," he said. "If you need time." Caroline reached up and began unbuttoning her dress. "I do not need time. I need you." What followed was tender and passionate, Silas's gentleness belying his size and strength. He was careful with her, reverent, and Caroline found herself responding to him with an abandon that would have shocked her Philadelphia self. This was her husband, this powerful, gentle mountain man, and she loved him with an intensity that frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the warm blankets while the wind whispered through the pines outside. Silas traced lazy patterns on Caroline's shoulder, and she could feel his heart beating steady and strong beneath her cheek. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. "Happier than I have ever been," Caroline answered honestly. "It is strange how life works. I thought I was coming here for one future and found something entirely different and infinitely better." "The wrong address that turned out to be right," Silas murmured. "Exactly." Caroline tilted her face up to kiss him. The exact right address. Winter arrived early and fierce. Snow began falling in late October and did not stop for days. The world transformed into a wonderland of white, beautiful, and deadly. Caroline was grateful for Silas's preparations. The cabin was snug and warm, the pantry stocked with enough food to last months, firewood stacked high under the shelter of the porch. They fell into a comfortable rhythm. Silas tended to the animals they kept, a few chickens in a sheltered coop and 2 goats for milk. He checked his trap lines when the weather permitted, bringing back furs and meat. Caroline kept the cabin, cooked, sewed, and discovered she had a talent for baking bread in the Dutch oven. They read together in the evenings, played cards, talked for hours about everything and nothing. Sometimes Silas would grow quiet, lost in memories of the war, and Caroline learned to recognize the signs. She would go to him, wrap her arms around him, and simply hold him until the shadows receded. He never spoke much about what he had seen, but she understood that some wounds went deeper than flesh. Other times the isolation pressed on Caroline. There were days when the wind howled and the snow fell so thick she could not see the trees beyond the porch, and she felt the weight of their solitude. But then Silas would pull her into his arms and hold her close, or make her laugh with some dry observation, or simply sit with her in comfortable silence, and she would remember that she was not alone. She had him. One night in January, the coldest night Caroline had ever experienced, she woke to find Silas gone from the bed. She climbed down from the loft to find him sitting before the fire, staring into the flames. "What is wrong?" she asked, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Cannot sleep," he said simply. Caroline sat beside him, leaning against his solid warmth. Tell me what you are thinking. Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I am thinking about how close I came to never meeting you. If the stagecoach had arrived a day earlier or later, if you had decided to return to Philadelphia, if I had not been in town that day, there are 1,000 ways we might have missed each other. But we did not miss each other, Caroline said. We found each other. That is what matters. I used to think that nothing good could come from the war, that it took everything and gave nothing back. But if the war had not happened, I would not have come here. I would not have been here when you arrived, so maybe something good did come from it after all. Caroline took his hand, threading her fingers through his. We make our own meaning from what life gives us. The war was terrible, but you survived it. You came here and built a life. You saved me when I had nowhere to go. That means something. You saved me too, Silas said quietly. I was just existing before you came, going through the motions. You reminded me how to live. They sat together in the firelight, and Caroline felt the truth of his words settle in her heart. They had saved each other, two lost souls finding home in the wilderness. By the time spring arrived, thawing the mountain passes and bringing green back to the world, Caroline knew she was pregnant. She had missed 2 courses and felt the telltale sickness in the mornings. She waited until she was certain before telling Silas. She chose an evening when he was carving by the fire, the scene so domestic it made her heart swell. Silas, I have something to tell you. He looked up, immediately alert to the serious note in her voice. What is it? I'm going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby. The knife and wood fell from Silas's hands. He stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, disbelief, and finally joy so profound it transformed his face. A baby? Yes, I think it will be born in the autumn, September, or October. Silas crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she was made of glass. Caroline, a baby. His voice was thick with emotion. I never thought I would have a family again. I never thought I deserved one. You deserve every happiness, Caroline said fiercely, and we are going to have a beautiful family. Are you scared? He asked, pulling back to look at her. A little, she admitted. It is so far from everything, from doctors and help. There is a midwife in Copper Ridge. Agnes mentioned she has delivered most of the babies in the territory. I will bring her here when the time comes, and I will take care of you. I promise you, Caroline, you and this baby will have everything you need. Caroline believed him. Over the following months, Silas was attentive to the point of being overprotective. He would not let her haul water or chop wood. He fussed over her eating, making sure she had plenty of meat and vegetables. He read to her in the evenings, his deep voice soothing, his hand resting protectively on her growing belly. As summer warmed the mountains, they made trips to Copper Ridge for supplies and to meet with the midwife, a capable woman named Martha who examined Caroline and pronounced her healthy and strong. Mountain women are tough, Martha said. You will do just fine. Caroline helped Silas in the garden, tending the vegetables that would see them through the next winter. Her body changed, swelling with life, and she felt beautiful and powerful in a way she never had before. Silas seemed to find her more attractive than ever, his hands constantly seeking her, his kisses tender and passionate by turns. One afternoon in late August, they lay together in the meadow near their cabin, surrounded by wildflowers. Silas's head rested on Caroline's belly, and she ran her fingers through his long hair, now shot through with a few strands of silver, though he was not yet 35. Have you thought about names? Caroline asked. For a boy, I was thinking about my brother. His name was James, if you do not mind. James is a good name. And for a girl? Whatever you want, Silas said. You're doing all the hard work. You should choose. Caroline smiled. What about Rose? It was my mother's name. Rose Reed. Silas tested the name. It is perfect. The baby came on a crisp September evening as the aspen leaves turned gold. Caroline's labor started in the afternoon, and Silas rode hard to Copper Ridge to fetch Martha. By the time they returned, Caroline's contractions were coming fast and hard. Martha took over with calm efficiency, and Silas held Caroline's hand, letting her squeeze until his bones ached, murmuring encouragement. You are the strongest woman I know, he told her. You can do this. And she did. Just after midnight, Their son entered the world with a lusty cry that made Silas laugh through tears. Martha cleaned the baby and placed him in Caroline's arms, a perfect tiny thing with dark hair and a scrunched red face. "James," Caroline whispered. "Hello, James." Silas touched his son's tiny hand with one thick finger, and James immediately gripped it. "He is strong," Silas said in wonder. "He takes after his father," Caroline said, exhausted but radiant. Martha stayed for 2 days, making sure Caroline and the baby were both healthy, teaching Caroline about nursing and caring for a newborn. Silas hovered anxiously, desperate to help but uncertain how. But he learned quickly, becoming adept at changing cloths and soothing the baby when he fussed. Caroline watched her large, scarred mountain man hold their tiny son with infinite gentleness and fell in love with him all over again. "You are a natural father," she told him. "I am terrified," he admitted. "He is so small. What if I do something wrong?" "You will not. You are careful and gentle, and you love him. That is all he needs." Life with a baby was challenging but joyful. James was a good baby, healthy and curious. As winter set in again, their second in the cabin, Caroline marveled at how different it felt from the first. Then, she had been learning to survive. Now, she was thriving. The cabin rang with baby sounds, James's cries and gurgles, and eventually his laughter. Silas was a devoted father. He carved toys for James, sang to him in his deep rumbling voice, carried him in a sling against his broad chest while he did chores. Caroline would watch them together and feel her heart swell with love so intense it almost hurt. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons. James grew from baby to toddler to sturdy little boy with his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair. When he was 3, Caroline became pregnant again, and this time she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born on a warm June morning, coming so fast there was barely time to fetch Martha. Silas delivered his own daughter with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face. "Rose," he said, laying the baby in Caroline's arms. "Our little Rose." Rose was different from James, quieter and more serious even as an infant. She watched the world with solemn eyes and smiled rarely, but when she did, it lit up the cabin like sunshine. James adored his little sister, always wanting to help care for her, and Silas was hopelessly wrapped around her tiny fingers. "I never knew I could love like this," Silas confessed to Caroline one night after the children were asleep. "I thought I understood when I fell in love with you, but this is different. It is terrifying how much I love them." "I know," Caroline said, "but it is a good kind of terrifying, is it not?" "The best kind," Silas agreed. When Rose was 2 and James was 5, Silas built an addition onto the cabin, creating separate sleeping rooms for the children. He also built a larger barn for the animals they had acquired, including 2 horses, a cow, more chickens, and a pig. The homestead was thriving, and so was their family. They made annual trips to Copper Ridge for supplies and to let the children see other people. James was friendly and outgoing, making friends easily. Rose was shyer, clinging to Caroline's skirts. But both children were bright and healthy, and Caroline had begun teaching James his letters and numbers. "We should think about school eventually," Caroline said one evening. Silas looked troubled. "The nearest school is in Copper Ridge. That is too far to ride every day, especially in winter." "I know. I thought perhaps I could teach them myself. I have enough education." "You have more than enough," Silas said. "You are one of the smartest people I have ever met. But is it fair to them, growing up so isolated?" "They have us. They have each other. They have these mountains. That is more than many children have." "They have your love and wisdom," Silas said, pulling her close. "That is worth more than anything." So Caroline became teacher as well as mother. She taught James to read using the few books they owned, and he took to it eagerly, his quick mind devouring every word. Rose, still very young, would sit with them during lessons, absorbing everything. Silas taught the children about the mountains, about tracking and hunting and respecting the wilderness. He taught them to ride, to fish, to identify animal sounds. He told them stories of his childhood and carefully edited versions of the war, trying to help them understand courage and sacrifice without burdening them with the darkness. When James was 7 and Rose was 4, Caroline became pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2. She was 31 now, and the work of the homestead, combined with caring for two active children, left her exhausted. Silas insisted she rest more, taking over many of her tasks. He cooked, cleaned, cared for the children, and managed the homestead, all while worrying constantly about Caroline. "I am fine," she kept telling him. "You are not fine. You are worn out. We should have waited longer between children." Silas Reed: "We did not plan this any more than we planned the others, and I am happy about it. A little tired, but happy." Their third child, another boy they named Thomas in honor of the man whose cabin had brought them together, was born on a snowy January morning. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Silas feared he would lose Caroline. But she was strong, just as she had always been, and Thomas entered the world red-faced and squalling. "He has got your temper," Silas said, kissing Caroline's sweaty forehead. "He's got your lungs," Caroline countered, listening to Thomas's impressive wails. James and Rose were fascinated by their new brother. James wanted to help with everything, and Rose would sit for hours just watching the baby sleep. The cabin felt smaller, but somehow more complete. Life settled into a new normal. Silas continued to hunt and trap, bringing in furs to trade in Copper Ridge for the supplies they could not produce themselves. Carolyn managed the household and taught the children, with Thomas often strapped to her back as she worked. The older children helped with chores, learning responsibility and the satisfaction of contributing to the family. When Thomas was 2, the homestead received an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed man rode up on a fine horse one summer morning, introducing himself as a surveyor for the territorial government. He explained that Montana was preparing for statehood and conducting land surveys. "You are sitting on unclaimed land," the surveyor said. "If you want to keep it, you need to file a claim." Silas looked troubled. "I have been here 12 years. I assume that gave me some right." "Squatters' rights are not recognized anymore, but you have clearly improved the land. If you file properly and pay the fees, this homestead can be yours legally." So Silas and Caroline traveled to the nearest land office and filed their claim, paying precious dollars to secure the land they had worked so hard to tame. They rode home with an official deed, and that night Silas nailed it to the wall inside the cabin. "This is ours now," he said, "truly ours. No one can take it from us." Caroline looked at the deed, at her children playing by the fire, at her husband's proud face, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. They had built something real and lasting here in the wilderness. The children continued to grow. James became a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as the outdoors. Rose was quiet and observant, with a gift for understanding animals. Thomas was the wild one, always climbing trees and getting into mischief, keeping everyone on their toes. When James was 12, Rose was 9, and Thomas was 5. Caroline realized she was pregnant again. She was 36, and the news filled her with equal parts joy and trepidation. This pregnancy was even more difficult than the last, and Silas insisted they travel to Copper Ridge so Caroline could be near Martha for the final months. They moved into a rented room above the Mercantile in September, and their 4th child, a daughter they named Elizabeth, was born in October. The birth was hard, and Martha warned Caroline that she should not have any more children. "Your body has given enough," Martha said gently. "Another pregnancy could be dangerous." Caroline looked at her 4 beautiful children and her devoted husband and knew Martha was right. "4 is a good number," she said to Silas. "4 is perfect," he agreed. "As long as you are healthy, that is all that matters." They returned to the homestead with baby Elizabeth, and life continued its steady rhythm. The children grew and thrived. James showed an aptitude for learning that reminded Caroline of her father. At 16, he expressed interest in attending school in Copper Ridge and possibly pursuing further education. "I want to become a teacher," he said, "like Ma, but for a real school." Silas was torn between pride and sadness. That would mean leaving the homestead. "Not forever," James said. "This is my home. I will always come back. But I want to learn more. I want to bring that knowledge back here." After much discussion, they arranged for James to board with Agnes and her husband in Copper Ridge during the school year. It was hard watching him ride away, but Caroline and Silas knew it was right. James came home every few weeks and spent summers at the homestead, helping with the work and teaching his siblings what he had learned. Rose showed no interest in leaving. She was content on the homestead, working with the animals, helping her mother, and exploring the mountains with her father. Thomas, at 12, was still too young to think about his future, but he seemed to take after Silas, happiest when he was working with his hands or tracking game through the forest. Elizabeth, the baby, was bright and cheerful, bringing laughter wherever she went. One evening in late summer, when Caroline was 42 and Silas was 47, they sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the peaks. The children were inside, the older ones helping Elizabeth with her letters. The sound of their voices drifted through the open window, and Caroline felt a profound sense of contentment. "Do you ever regret it?" Silas asked quietly. "Staying here? You could have gone back east at any point. You could have had an easier life." Caroline took his hand, rough and calloused from years of hard work. "I have never regretted it for a single moment. This is the life I was meant to have. You are the man I was meant to love. Everything that happened, all the pain and struggle before I came here, it led me to this, to you, to our children, to this home." "I am the luckiest man alive," Silas said. "The day you showed up in Copper Ridge, I thought I was just helping out a neighbor. I had no idea you would change my entire world." "The wrong address," Carolyn said with a smile. "The right address," Silas corrected, leaning in to kiss her. "The exact right address." The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and small milestones. James finished his education and returned home to teach at a new school built in a settlement that had grown up halfway between Copper Ridge and the homestead. He married a sweet girl named Sarah, and they built a cabin near the school. Within a few years, Caroline and Silas had 3 grandchildren to spoil. Rose surprised everyone by falling in love with a young rancher who had moved to the area. She married at 23, and she and her husband established a ranch 20 miles from the homestead, close enough to visit regularly. She gave birth to twin girls, and Carolyn made the journey to help her daughter through those overwhelming early months of motherhood. Thomas grew into a younger version of his father, tall and strong with the same quiet competence. At 18, he announced he was not interested in marriage, but wanted to push further into the mountains, exploring territory few white men had seen. Silas gave him his blessing and the best horse, and Thomas would disappear for months at a time, always returning with stories and furs and a restlessness that reminded Caroline of a younger Silas. Elizabeth, at 16, was courted by half the young men in the territory, but she showed no interest in settling down. "I want to see things first," she told Caroline. "I want adventures like Uncle Thomas has." Caroline understood. She had been restless once, too, desperate for something more than the life she had been born into. She and Silas gave Elizabeth their blessing to attend a teaching college in Helena, the territorial capital, with the understanding that she would always have a home to return to. When Caroline was 50 and Silas was 55, they found themselves alone in the cabin for the first time in decades. The children were grown and scattered, pursuing their own lives, and the homestead was quiet. In a way it had not been since before James was born. It is strange," Caroline said one evening. "The house feels too big now." "It does," Silas agreed. He had aged well, still strong and capable, though his hair was now more silver than brown and his beard was completely gray. "But I'm not sorry to have you to myself again," Caroline laughed. "We are like newlyweds again, except we both creak when we stand up." "Speak for yourself," Silas said, pulling her into his arms. "I still feel young when I'm holding you." They danced there in the cabin, no music but the crackling fire and the wind in the pines, and Caroline rested her head against Silas's broad chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong as it had been for nearly 30 years. The grandchildren visited often, filling the cabin with noise and chaos. Caroline taught them to read and bake bread. Silas taught them to track and fish and whittle. They told stories of the old days, of how Caroline had arrived on a stagecoach expecting to marry Thomas Hendricks and ended up with Silas instead. "It was fate," Caroline would tell the grandchildren. "It was luck," Silas would counter. "It was love," and they would say together, and the grandchildren would giggle at their grandparents' obvious affection. One spring morning, when Caroline was 58, she and Silas walked through the meadow where they had lain together decades before, planning names for their unborn child. The wildflowers were blooming, painting the world in purple and yellow and red. "Do you remember this place?" Caroline asked. "I remember every moment with you," Silas said. "Every single one is precious." Caroline stopped walking and turned to face him, taking both his hands. "We have had a good life, have we not?" "The best life," Silas confirmed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "I want you to know something." Caroline's eyes were bright. "That day in the mercantile, when you offered to help me, I thought you were the most frightening man I had ever seen, so big and rough and intimidating. And now? Now I cannot imagine feeling anything but safe when I look at you. You are my home, Silas. This cabin, these mountains, our children and grandchildren, they are all wonderful. But you are my home. You always have been." Silas pulled her close, and they stood there in the meadow, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their former lives. That evening, the entire family gathered at the homestead for a rare reunion. James and Sarah brought their children. Rose and her husband came with the twins. Thomas had just returned from a year in the Northern Territories. Elizabeth traveled from Helena with a young man she was courting. The cabin overflowed with people, and Caroline cooked an enormous feast while Silas told stories to the grandchildren. After dinner, when the children had been put to bed in various corners of the cabin and the adults sat around the fire, James raised his cup. "To Ma and Pa," he said, "for building this family and this home, for teaching us how to work hard and love deeply, for showing us what a good marriage looks like." Everyone raised their cups, and Caroline felt tears prick her eyes. She looked at Silas and found him looking back at her with such love that it took her breath away, even after all these years. "It started with a wrong address," Silas said, his voice carrying through the cabin. "Caroline came here to marry Thomas Hendricks. She ended up at my door instead. Best mistake that ever happened." "It was not a mistake," Caroline said. "It was meant to be. That cabin, Thomas's cabin, was the right address for me after all. It brought me to you." "The right address," several voices echoed, and then Elizabeth, always the dramatic one, started singing an old song about homecoming. Others joined in, their voices blending in harmony, and Caroline sat there surrounded by her family, the life she had built, and knew that she had found exactly what she had been searching for all those years ago when she stepped off that stagecoach in Copper Ridge. The years continued their inevitable march. Silas and Caroline grew older, but remained active, still managing the homestead with help from Thomas, who had finally decided to settle nearby. More grandchildren arrived, and then the first great-grandchildren, and the family tree that had started with two lost souls in the Montana wilderness spread its branches wide. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered again. Caroline was 62, Silas was 67, and they sat in chairs of honor on the porch while 3 generations celebrated around them. James gave a speech about courage and love. Rose presented them with a quilt she had sewn, each square representing a different family member. Thomas had carved them a beautiful set of matching rocking chairs. Elizabeth read a poem she had written about coming home. When the celebration wound down and the last guests had departed, Caroline and Silas sat in their new rocking chairs, watching the stars emerge over the mountains. Silas reached over and took Caroline's hand. 40 years, he said. Feels like both a lifetime and no time at all. I would do it all again, Caroline said. Every hard moment, every struggle, every joy. All of it exactly the same, because it led to this. I love you, Caroline Reed. I loved you the moment I saw you, and I will love you until I draw my last breath. And I love you, Silas Reed. You saved me when I thought I could not be saved. You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. You gave me a family and a life beyond anything I imagined. They sat there in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other in the vastness of the wilderness and built something that would last long after they were gone. The mountains stood eternal around them, bearing witness to their love story, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the rising moon. Caroline thought back to that terrified girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in Copper Ridge 40 years earlier, clutching a letter from a man she had never met, desperate and alone. She thought about Thomas Hendricks, the man she had never known, whose death had seemed like the end of everything but had actually been the beginning. She thought about the moment she had first seen Silas in the mercantile, large and intimidating and unexpectedly kind. "Do you think Thomas would have approved?" she asked suddenly. "Of us, I mean. We did meet because of him in a way." Silas considered the question. "I think Thomas wanted you to be happy. I think if he could have known that his cabin would lead you to me, and that we would have this life together, he would have been glad. He was a good man. He would have wanted your happiness above all else." "Then it all worked out exactly as it should have," Carolyn said. "The wrong address that was actually right all along." "The right address," Silas confirmed, bringing her hand to his lips. "The only address that mattered." They rocked gently in their chairs, the stars wheeling overhead, the night sounds of the mountains surrounding them. Inside the cabin, their legacy slept in the form of children and grandchildren who would carry their story forward. The homestead they had built would endure. The love they had nurtured would echo through generations. Caroline Reed, who had come west as a desperate mail-order bride to the wrong address, had found her place in the world. She had found love and purpose and a home in the arms of a scarred mountain man who had taught her that wrong turns could lead to the most right destinations. And as she sat there beside her husband of 40 years, Caroline knew with absolute certainty that every step of her journey, every hardship and joy, had been worth it to arrive at this moment, this life, this love. The mountains stood watch over them, ancient and eternal, and the story of the bride who came to the wrong address and found the right one would be told around fires for generations to come, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from unexpected places, and that love can be found even in the wildest wilderness if two hearts are brave enough to seek it.